Welcome to the History AI podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the History AI podcast. I'm Chuck.
And I'm Marco. Before we dive in, do us a quick favor, hit that subscribe button and leave us a 5-star review. It's the best way to help more folks discover the show.
Seriously, it takes just a second and it means the world to us. Plus, you'll never miss an episode. Everyone is evergreen, so they stay relevant anytime you hit play.
Alright, now let's get into it. Today we're heading into the stormy political waters of the War of 1812 to talk about the Hartford Convention.
A meeting that started as a political protest and ended up becoming the kiss of death for the Federalist Party.
Drama, secession, and the worst political timing ever. Let's get into it.
Alright, let's start with the basics. Who actually called the Hartford Convention?
That would be the Federalists, specifically the Massachusetts legislature. They issued the formal call in late 1814, and the idea was quickly supported by other New England states like Connecticut and Rhode Island. New Hampshire and Vermont also sent some unofficial delegates.
And it wasn't just political posturing. These guys were genuinely alarmed. By 1814, the War of 1812 had dragged on for over 2 years. British forces had occupied parts of Maine, blockaded the coast, and even burned Washington, D.C.
Right, and New England was bearing the brunt of the economic pain. Remember, this region was heavily reliant on maritime trade. The British naval blockade and the U.S. government's embargoes were choking their economy.
Plus, the Federalists already hated the war to begin with. They'd voted against it back in 1812. They saw it as a reckless, ideologically driven conflict cooked up by Southern and Western war hawks.
So when things got worse in 1814, Federalist leaders decided it was time to take serious political action. They weren't just frustrated, they were afraid that the national government was becoming too powerful and too dismissive of regional interests. Which is funny because the Federalist had been the party of increasing the power of the federal government.
And that's when they called for delegates to gather in Hartford, Connecticut, to figure out what to do. But what they didn't know was that this meeting would change the course of their party forever.
It was supposed to be a show of strength and solidarity. Instead, it turned into the political equivalent of stepping on a rake. So now that we know who called the Hartford Convention, let's get into why they met. And spoiler alert, it wasn't just about complaining over bad trade deals.
Not at all. The War of 1812 had pushed New England to the brink. Economically, they were suffering under the weight of British blockades and Jefferson's earlier Embargo Act. Ports like Boston and Providence were practically ghost towns.
And politically, Federalists in New England felt increasingly marginalized. They believed the Democratic Republicans, especially under Madison, were ignoring the region's needs and dragging the country into a disastrous war.
On top of that, there was a real fear of invasion. British troops had already landed in parts of Maine, and with Washington burned to the ground in August 1814, it looked like the federal government couldn't even protect its own capital, let alone the coast of New England.
Which brings us to the core reason they met, to consider how New England states could protect their interests, economically, politically, and even militarily. And yes, that included exploring more radical solutions.
Like changing the Constitution. Or, even more controversially, possibly seceding from the Union. That last part was whispered, not shouted, but it was definitely in the air.
The official goal was to propose constitutional amendments that would limit federal power and protect regional autonomy. But make no mistake, this was also about sending a political message: you ignore us at your peril.
So this wasn't just a gripe session. It was a carefully calculated response to what they saw as an existential crisis, one that threatened their economy, their influence, and their place in the young American Republic.
And the stakes couldn't have been higher.
So let's talk about the elephant in the room: secession.
Yeah, it wasn't officially on the agenda, but it was definitely on people's minds. The Federalists were frustrated, but some were outright furious. They felt that the federal government had become tyrannical, trampling on their economic lifelines and ignoring their voices in Congress.
And remember, this was all happening in secret. The convention was held behind closed doors in Hartford's old state house from December 15, 1814, to January 5, 1815. That secrecy fueled speculation that the delegates were plotting to pull New England out of the Union.
Now, were all the delegates in favor of secession? Not at all. In fact, many were deeply cautious. They worried that disunion would only invite chaos or even civil war.
But there were hardliners. Timothy Pickering, former Secretary of State and a leading Massachusetts Federalist, had previously floated the idea of a Northern Confederacy. He believed New England could survive, and maybe even thrive, on its own.
Despite that, the majority of delegates settled on a safer, more strategic path. They proposed a series of constitutional amendments designed to weaken what they saw as unchecked federal, and especially Southern, power.
These included requiring a 2/3 vote in Congress to declare war, admit new states, or impose embargoes. They also wanted to eliminate the 3/5 clause, which they believed gave the South disproportionate influence by counting enslaved people for representation.
Another proposal? Limiting presidents to a single term and barring successive presidents from the same state, which was a direct jab at Virginia. Remember, Washington, Jefferson, and Madison were all Virginians.
So instead of throwing a Molotov cocktail at the Constitution, they tried to rewrite the rulebook. But even those moderate proposals were about to crash headfirst into a wave of patriotic fervor.
Because just as they finished drafting their demands, history pulled the rug out from under them. So here's where it all goes sideways for the Federalists: timing.
You couldn't script a worse political misfire. The delegates finished their proposals in early January 1815 and prepared to send envoys to Washington, D.C. to present their demands. But while they were still packing their bags, two things happened.
First, the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed on December 24, 1814, right in the middle of the convention. That treaty ended the War of 1812. But news traveled slowly, so no one at the convention knew yet.
And then, in early January, came the second bombshell, the Battle of New Orleans. On January 8, 1815, General Andrew Jackson scored a stunning and lopsided victory over the British.
It was an absolute rout, and even though the battle technically happened after the war had ended, the public didn't know that yet either. So when word reached the States, Americans believed Jackson's victory had ended the war and saved the nation.
And here come the Federalists, strolling into Washington with their list of grievances and constitutional demands, just as the country is riding high on a wave of patriotic euphoria.
It was like walking into a party where everyone's cheering and popping champagne, and you show up with a binder full of complaints.
Their demands were instantly overshadowed, and worse, painted as defeatist and unpatriotic. People started asking, why were they holding secret meetings during wartime? Were they trying to break up the Union?
That perception stuck, even though they never officially called for secession. The timing made it look like they were rooting against America, and in 1815, that was political suicide.
So what happens when your big political statement backfires? The war ends in a patriotic high, and you're seen as the guy who brought a wet blanket to the victory parade.
You get erased. That's pretty much what happened to the Federalist Party after the Hartford Convention.
Their image took a massive hit. Even though the delegates hadn't endorsed secession, the idea that they even discussed it, combined with the secrecy and the terrible timing, was enough to brand them as disloyal.
And public opinion turned viciously against them. People started using words like treason and sedition. Newspapers lampooned the convention. Political cartoons mocked the delegates as cowards and conspirators.
The Federalist Party had already been on shaky ground. Their base was shrinking, especially as the country expanded westward and became more agrarian and democratic. This just sealed the deal.
After the war, the Democratic Republicans embraced nationalism, internal improvements, and economic development, things that had once been Federalist positions. And since the Federalists were now tainted as anti-American elites, they couldn't even claim credit for their own ideas.
By the 1820s, they were a spent force. They didn't field a serious presidential candidate again after 1816. James Monroe won the presidency in a near-unanimous landslide, ushering in what historians call the era of good feelings.
Which is a polite way of saying, the Federalists were gone, and there was no real opposition left.
So the Hartford Convention didn't just fail, it actually helped kill the party that organized it.
One meeting, one bad call, and boom, political extinction.
So what did we learn today? Timing is everything, politics is brutal, and maybe, just maybe, don't flirt with secession during wartime.
Seriously. Thanks for hanging out with us on the History AI podcast.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit that subscribe button and leave us a 5-star review. It helps more than you know.
And hey, don't keep all this juicy history to yourself, share the podcast with a fellow history buff. Word of mouth is how we grow this community.
Big shout out to BL&C Emporium, that's where you can grab our exclusive merch and so much more. Hoodies, mugs, posters, you name it, they've got it. Check the link in the show notes.
And don't forget, all our episodes are evergreen. You can listen anytime and still get something new out of it.
Got a topic idea? Hit us up on social media, we love hearing from you.
Until next time, stay curious, history nerds.
In the winter of 14, New England gathered near. Snow on the windows and war in the air. They came to Hartford with worry and pride, while cannons in New Orleans burned the southern sky. Massachusetts men with Connecticut ink, Rhode Island voices too bitter to drink. They spoke of secession, of breaking the chain, of war-torn horizons and Federalist shame. So raise up a glass for the party now past, for the dreams of the old guard that couldn't quite last. The ink on the parchment was barely still dry when peace came from Ghent. History passed them by. They said Madison's madness has cost us too much. This war with old Britain was folly and such. They whispered of changes, of power return, but the embers of empire had already burned. 12 states still standing, one union, one name, and talk of disunion was branded with shame. The Federalist banner, once bold in the fight, fell dim in the dawn of the nationalist light. So raise up a glass for the party now past, for the dreams of the old guard that couldn't quite last. The ink on the parchment was barely still dry when peace came from Ghent. History passed them by. From Adams to Hamilton, thunder and fire, but pride turned to silence and lost its desire. The people remember the stars and the stripes, not backroom conventions or bitter old gripes. No treason was written, no lines were crossed, but the faith in their cause was quietly lost. The papers were printed, the critics were loud, and the Federalist voice was drowned by the crowd. So raise up a glass for the party now past, for the dreams of the old guard that couldn't quite last. The future marched forward with Jefferson's men. The Hartford Convention would not meet again. The last toast was bitter, the hall now is still, and the nation moved on, as it always will.